Hi, and welcome to our continuing coverage in the print on the deepening diplomatic crisis between India and Canada. It's my honor to be joined today by Dr. Michael Rubin at the American Enterprise Institute, former official at the Pentagon, and one of the leading experts in the world on the Middle East. Dr. Rubin, my first question, you've said in interviews and written earlier that you believed Canada had jumped the gun on the allegations it had made against India. We're speaking now that the United States ambassador to Ottawa has said that Five Eyes intelligence helped Canada make the allegations it did. In your view, does that change your assessment? Is it an indictment of India? Does it prove that India did carry out an assassination of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil?
No, it absolutely doesn't change anything. First of all, it's no surprise that the United States or Canada would spy on India. And frankly, India spies on the United States and Canada as well. So let's put aside umbrage with regard to that. When I worked at the Pentagon, I used to receive intelligence. And when you are looking at, for example, telephone intercepts, they're never really cut and dry. And no Indian official or any other official worth their salt is going to speak so clearly over the phone. So while there might be some signals intelligence, it probably doesn't, it's not as clear as perhaps Justin Trudeau wants to make it out to be, which is why no one else actually made such a big deal about it until Justin Trudeau jumped the gun at the Canadian Parliament.
So I want to come back to Justin Trudeau jumping the gun in just a minute. But one of the fascinating things I found in your writing on this issue was you mentioned that controversies like this aren't unknown. 2018, the United Kingdom confronted with the poisoning of a Russian dissident on its soil. Many past issues like this, and the convention seems to have been, even in the United Kingdom case, that there's some form of legal investigation or parliamentary inquiry before allegations are made against a nation state. Why, in your view, did Justin Trudeau not take that path? After all, he has police services investigating this matter.
Well, in my view, I can't get into Justin Trudeau's head, but in this case, I don't think we can separate it from the difficulties he's having in the Canadian elections, as well as the difficulties he's been having on the world stage. While he was embraced when he came into office as a fresh face, many Canadians, even his own former supporters, are deeply frustrated by what they see as his shallowness. And therefore, I honestly think if it had that much forethought, he was simply trying to change the conversation. But I'm not convinced he had that much forethought when he pushed this forward. But once it was out there, once there was the outrage, then he simply felt that he had to circle the wagons, and he's been trying to drag the United States in. Praveen, you talked about how the U.S. ambassador to Canada said this. I do think the Indian audience needs to understand how the State Department looks at its diplomatic mission in Canada. First of all, we have political appointees, we have career appointees. Canada always has a political appointee, but it's not like Japan or Australia. It doesn't have someone who's the most capable. At the same time, when the United States sends diplomats to Canada, Canada is used as the reserve spot for people who have family trouble, people who may be sick, who need to get back to the United States quickly. No one in the State Department has ever reached the top by basing their career on Canada. So when David Cohen answers the call as the U.S. ambassador in Ottawa to talk to Canadian TV, I don't think he was doing anything more than checking the box. And while technically the U.S. ambassador in every country has oversight over intelligence operations in that country, I don't get the sense that David Cohen knew anything about this until Justin Trudeau's appearance in Parliament, because usually the ambassadors just put it aside and let the professionals do their jobs.
Michael, one of the things I'm very interested in this affair is This must be a dilemma for the United States, though. On the one hand, you have India, which is a cornerstone of the Indo-Pacific strategy of pushing back against China, a number of other issues. On the other hand, a relationship which with Canada that whatever Canada's or Justin Trudeau's place on the world stage might be, there is an old relationship that survived the test of two world wars. If you'd been in a presidential advisor today, how would you have been advising President Biden to handle these two sort of conflicting, if you like, demands on American diplomatic attention?
Well, first of all, I don't think that either the American relationship with Canada is over, nor for that matter is India's. The fact of the matter is, I'm actually very, very confident in how the White House is trying to handle this behind the scenes. There's two strategies. One is sort of like what we did after the Afghan withdrawal. Hope the crisis simply goes away as a new crisis looms and the press focus moves on. That's what Jake Sullivan, the U.S. National Security Advisor, would be thinking. It worked with, from the U.S. standpoint, the disaster of our Afghanistan withdrawal, which is far greater, again, from Washington's standpoint, than this crisis, simply because it's about us and we tend to emphasize things which are about us. The other issue is, while Justin Trudeau, in theory, could be prime minister until 2025, his alliance with the left-leaning New Democrats in Canada isn't secure, and that there could be a snap election at any day. I think deep down the United States, when Secretary of State Antony Blinken talks about the need to cooperate on an investigation, is simply trying to kick the can down the road until Justin Trudeau is out of office, and then the United States, India, and Canada can become much more serious again about the issues which really confront us.
As someone who's looked at diplomacy close up, I mean, you handle things like Iraq, which were tremendously fraught crises. Would you have been were you surprised by the fact that this issue, which after all involves a movement which is dead in India and even in the diaspora, is not something that, shall we say, commands a tidal wave of support? Are you surprised that leaders of Canada and India have allowed it to become such an overwhelming issue to the point where visas are slashed and spies are outed and sent back? Do you believe there could have been more moderate and rational ways of dealing with this problem? Or is this an inevitable consequence of the politics around this issue?
Well, I think you actually are absolutely right in asking that question. You know, when you have a cancer, you get rid of it. You don't let it metastasize. And the United States is at fault. Canada is certainly at fault for allowing this Khalistani separatism, which doesn't have any legitimacy among Khalistanis among Sikhs in India, to metastasize in Canada. But if there's a silver lining to the current crisis, then it's the fact that no one is going to be dismissive of this terrorist group and these terrorists any longer. This is now on the tip of our tongues. Even though it's almost 40 years past, people are understanding what Air India 182 was about. They're understanding what has gone on elsewhere. What I worry about just generally, because Americans tend, again, to navel gaze. We tend to focus on Washington. We don't think about other countries' security threats as much as we should, is that there's a tendency among some in the United States to want to add legitimacy to any movement they hear about. And that's dangerous because, again, as you said, there is no Khalistani separatist movement inside India itself. Anyone who's interested in it doesn't know India anymore. The point is, the analogy I make in my mind, and I don't mean to be such a history nerd, is to Katanga separatism in Congo, in Zaire. That was wholly financed by Belgian financiers who wanted a share of the copper income. It had no legitimacy whatsoever, and it was important to allow it to die a death rather than to give it, to preserve it in any way. That's the same strategy we should be taking. And just to square the circle finally, when I look at Sikhs for Justice or other Sikh groups, Khalistani groups, so to speak, in the United States, a lot of it tends to be more about ego and finance than any sincere belief in what they're doing back inside Punjab.
In fact, we'll post the link here, but fascinating study that you participated in and you mentioned together with Dr. Christine Fair and Sadanand Dhume at the AEI and Aparna Pandey on this issue. I'd commend that to any of our viewers who are interested. A question here, has terrorism in the many decades since the tragic bombing of Air India 182, the Kanishka. You mentioned Afghanistan. Is there some danger that terrorism and is sort of disappearing off the attention of the public, yes, but also of policymakers in Western capitals? Is that something that concerns you?
That is something that concerns me. I mean, certainly in the United States context, we talk about whether we're returning to the pre 9/11 era, where we forget about vacuums that exist in state failures and how terrorist groups can fill them. It's seldom the forces of altruism that fill these vacuums when a state's government collapses. So that very, very much worries me. That said, again, given the attacks on the San Francisco consulate in the United States, given what everyone's now learning about Hardeep Singh Nijjar, the fact of the matter is people are going to be taking Khalistani separatism very, very seriously from here on in. And people are going to be asking just what is the motivation of Canada making itself a safe haven for terror and for terror finance in this regard?
With your history professor hat on, so to speak, the United States and Canada have had, I mean, they sort of bruising bouts over India feeling that the United States isn't taking its security concerns seriously enough, are very, very old. And I think one of the things Indians sometimes don't understand is that India isn't the only issue that's been fraught in the United States. You had your battles with the United Kingdom over the IRA. As a multinational country with immigrants from all over the world, US diplomacies had to grapple with a number of these nationalist movements. Would it be fair to say that that's a consistent problem? This isn't new really to America?
Well, that's absolutely fair to say. And certainly when we have congressmen and someone can take a specific movement as a cause and amplify it beyond what is due, that certainly becomes a problem. That said, where India is strong is twofold. Number one, India's diplomatic representation over the last several years has been much better than what it was 20 years ago. People used to joke that in most countries, protocol is used to ease diplomacy. With regard to India, it was used to obscure diplomacy. Meanwhile, if you wanted to have a nice, relaxing discussion, you could have a whiskey with a Pakistani diplomat, never mind what they were actually doing behind the scenes. Now there's a greater skill, or at least understanding of the way the Washington culture works among the Indian diplomats. So hats off, not only to the current ambassador, but to previous ambassadors as well. At the same time, what sets India apart from many other states is that the embrace of India in the United States is truly bipartisan. What else can you get George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden agreeing on? Not much. Israel has become a political football. Saudi Arabia has become a political football, but everyone is sincerely invested in growing the US-India relationship. That's why I believe that this crisis is actually going to make us stronger.
On how nation states should deal with these kinds of problems, India is not the first country to become frustrated with external sponsors of terrorism. We don't, I mean, obviously have any way of knowing whether India has sought to retaliate against terrorists overseas or not, but I assume competent intelligence services would do that. Let me ask you this question bluntly. Should nation states be entitled to use force against their adversaries overseas or not? The United States has done it. Other countries have done it. If so, what norms and what sort of guidelines should guide the international community where legal means seem to break down?
Well, look, I'm not a diplomat. I'll give you a short answer. Yes, I think they should, but should have the right to target terrorists overseas with certain conditions. Number one, I'm comfortable saying this in the case of the United States, Israel, France, India, who are democracies and have democratic processes. It shouldn't be the tool of first resort. And with regard to Osama bin Laden, of course, it wasn't. The United States had repeatedly sought his extradition, first from the Taliban's Afghanistan and then from Pakistan. Likewise, India had repeatedly sought Nijar's extradition from Canada. He was on the United States no-fly list. So we talk about Five Eyes intelligence. Certainly we thought he was a terrorist, no matter what warm and fuzzy feelings Justin Trudeau may have had because of his own political desires to cultivate certain swing districts. So the short answer is yes, but this doesn't mean it's open season for example, the Iranian government to assassinate Mike Pompeo or Donald Trump because they don't like him. There's a fundamental difference between democracies and non-democracies in this regard.
And I should tell our viewers that actually you've been at the receiving end of the anger of an authoritarian or two. President Recep Erdogan of Turkey making various manner of threats, other governments. So you're speaking from a degree of experience here of the dangers authoritarians.
I mean, the Iranians have come after me when I was overseas once as well.
When this debate broke out after 9/11 about how terrorism ought to be tackled. After 9/11, there seemed to be this sort of moment of consensus in the international community that all nation states were endangered if countries did not unite to take on terrorism. Why, in your opinion, has that consensus frayed over the years? To the point where leaders like Trudeau and others in some other parts of the world seem much more reluctant about the use of both legal means and force against violent extremists.
Well, first of all, the elephant in the room, of course, would be the United States invasion of Iraq on the basis of faulty intelligence, as well as our pursuit of the global war on terrorism. I'm not going to condemn what the United States did. That's a debate for another time. But it would be foolish to pretend that that wasn't shaping opinion with regard to overreach or whether such policies could be taken too far. But as an academic, let me say this. One of the things that I find most shocking about the counterterror fight is that there's no international consensus definition of what terrorism is. In 1988, according to Columbia University, among Western security agencies, there were 100 different definitions of terrorism. By 2006, that had increased to more than 250 different definitions. So what we end up having is an a la carte definition approach to terrorism, where terrorism is always bad unless it happens to be for a cause with which we agree. Where I think the United States and India could work, the second and the first largest democracies, of course, together, is if we could come up with a joint definition of terrorism and say that no one else will get any counterterrorism cooperation unless they sign on to that. It would be nice to have a definition of terrorism that is unique and there's a consensus among democracies, and then we could take it to the United Nations rather than having hundreds of these definitions bantering about to the point where everyone's hands are tied or everyone just engages in moral equivalence.
One of the things we've heard Indians say many times in the context of the Canadian debate is that, look, everybody else everybody else's terrorists seem to get acted against. There have been Canadian prosecutions under hate speech, and justly so, for a variety of offenses, whether they're anti-Semitic, anti-Roma even, a variety of other things. But we don't see Khalistanis get acted against in the same way, or hate speech by Islamists against Hindus get acted against in the same way. Would you agree that there is a degree of Hinduphobia in the West, or is that the wrong way of understanding this particular problem?
I would agree on one hand that there is some Hinduphobia in the West, but it's not spontaneous. It's not indigenous. I mean, the Indian community in the United States and Canada are wildly successful economically, intellectually, career-wise, and so forth. When we are talking about the Hinduphobia, we're talking about deliberate efforts on the part of some outside powers in order to spread this Hinduphobia and to target Hindu communities or other communities. We see this when, for example, some Khalistani activists outside of Sacramento, California, seem to be so well funded through GoFundMe accounts where any ordinary person might have trouble raising $10, $20. And the fact of the matter is, when you can channel money through PayPal, when you can channel money through GoFundMe, that's something which certainly our Department of Treasury and other Treasury departments, finance departments, intelligence departments the world over are starting to look at. Here, there's actually a parallel to what happened before 9/11 with regard to the so-called Hawala payments that terrorists used and Islamic extremists used to fund each other, and how there was a crackdown after 9/11. I'm a frequent traveler to Somalia, and when I talk to the people involved in those payments, I mean, what happened in 2011 and how they were cracked down upon is still something they talk about. So we do need to recognize that this isn't spontaneous. A lot of it has its origins in Islamabad, if I can be quite frank, because when we see some of these activists, they are 1 or 2 degrees separated from the Pakistani Inter-Services Intelligence Agency.
Jeez. I know, Michael, that you have another appointment to rush to, but I'll trouble you with the last couple of questions, if I may. One of the things I hear from Western officials in response to arguments like those you're making is that, look, we agree that we might not always be on the ball with Indian counterterrorism concerns, but equally, Indian police services can be sloppy and inefficient. Their paperwork isn't great. They don't do enough to gather supportive evidence other than the mere statements of accused individuals. Do you think India needs to be doing more in evidentiary terms and in diplomatic terms to be taking its case more persuasively to Western policymakers and courts?
Frankly, I do believe that India is taken very seriously and is persuasive among American and other Western agencies. You know, is there room for cooperation in evidentiary issues, processing, and so forth? Certainly. But after the Mumbai attacks, certainly no one doubted what India was saying. India was very, very forthcoming and forthright with the proof as they put their case together. And if I may, I mean, the fact that Justin Trudeau can't achieve the same thing right now suggests that, I mean, he's much more, there's much more rhetoric there than actual fact when it comes to him. India, however, I don't see this as a problem.
So a little sort of digression there. You've served at high levels of government. We're speaking just a couple of days after it's turned out that the United Kingdom and Russia, while fighting each other in Ukraine, have actually been conducting secret negotiations. Do you believe that the United States and other countries, for all the hostile polemic that we're seeing right now, might be conversing at the diplomatic and strategic level to try and find a way out of this?
I absolutely do believe that's the case. And, you know, India, Canada, the United States, whatever the current disputes, we're not hostile countries. We're friends. We're having a minor spat. I believe what the United States is going to try to do is simply tell Justin Trudeau, you need to mute what you're saying. You can't dig yourself into a hole. This is the real problem right now. But my concern with regard to the United States is that once the progressives in Congress seize upon something as an issue, Secretary of State Antony Blinken might, for political reasons, seize upon it. And I want to make sure that the India issue, the India-Canada issue, is out of the front burner before this can happen. Remember, Tony Blinken, his career was as then Senator Joe Biden's foreign policy aide. He grew up for decades in the Senate. He's accustomed to political posturing, to virtue signaling, and that can be dangerous to long-term relations. So it's crucial. And I believe that the United States is trying to do this because Joe Biden understands the problem he has with his own progressive base, is going to try to get this off the front burner before it can spin out of control.
A last sort of basket of issues, I think, is in India. The country only emerging relatively recently in its history from the shadows of the Cold War, if you like. Very easy to rile up people into an anti-Western posture. Everyone's out to get you. Does it worry you at all that what is, in the grand scheme of things, as you put it, a minor spat, might dent strategic collaboration on big picture things like the Quad or like India-China technology and military cooperation, which have made enormous momentum in the last few years?
I don't think we're there yet, simply because there are many more saner heads out there. People who are less hot-headed than Justin Trudeau who understand what's at stake. And people also increasingly realize this isn't an India-Canada problem. This is an India-Justin Trudeau problem. And one irony here is while Indian commentators, journalists, diplomats will say that Justin Trudeau is in over his head, the thing with which they have remarkable consistency is when you look at what the Canadian commentators are saying, they're saying Justin Trudeau is in over their head. They're not blaming Prime Minister Modi. They're blaming their own prime minister. And therefore, I do think that this problem will be resolved.
Michael Rubin, thank you very, very much for making the time. I know you have a busy schedule, but I look forward to the next time we get to speak about hopefully other issues, since I think we're all agreed the sooner this storm passes on, the better for everyone. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks.
Good evening.